The trauma room at SSM St. Joseph Hospital West was silent except for the mechanical rhythm of a ventilator and the flat, unbroken tone of a heart monitor that refused to sing. 14-year-old John Smith lay motionless on the gurney, his skin the color of winter clouds, his lips tinged blue like the icy water that had swallowed him whole 43 minutes earlier. Around him, a team of doctors and nurses moved with the practiced efficiency of those who had done everything they could, their faces etched with exhaustion and defeat. The emergency physician, Dr. Kent Sutterer, glanced at the clock on the wall. Then back at the boy's still chest, calculating the moment when he would have to speak the words no parent should ever hear. Outside the room, through the small window in the door, a mother was about to arrive, a mother who did not yet know that her son was already gone. The lake had been merciless that January morning, its surface a deceptive sheet of crystal that concealed the 40-degree darkness below. When John Smith broke through the ice at Lake St. Louis in Missouri, the cold water flooded his lungs instantly, dragging him down into the murky depths where rocks and silt waited 15 feet below. His friends' screams echoed across the frozen expanse as they too fell through, their arms flailing for purchase on ice that crumbled like sugar glass beneath their weight. For 15 minutes, John's body floated suspended in that liquid tomb, his heart slowing with each passing second, his brain starving for oxygen it would not receive. The silence beneath the surface was absolute, broken only by the muffled sounds of rescue crews above, searching desperately for a boy who might already be beyond saving. Then Tommy Sheen, a firefighter from the Wentzville Fire Protection District, felt something he could not explain, a presence, a voice, an instruction that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. He moved 2 steps to the left, exactly 2, and plunged his recovery pole into the water with a certainty that defied logic. The hook snagged on something solid, something human, and when Shine pulled with all his strength, John Smith's lifeless body broke the surface. Water streaming from his mouth and nose, his eyes fixed and dilated. The paramedics descended upon him immediately, their hands pumping his chest in desperate rhythm, their voices calling out vitals that grew more dire with each passing moment. No pulse, no respiration, core temperature dropping, but they did not stop, could not stop. Even as the minutes stretched into an eternity and the winter sun climbed higher in the pale Missouri sky. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. John Smith had been an ordinary boy before that Monday in January 2015. The kind of kid who loved basketball, despite standing only 5'3", who laughed too loud with his friends, Josh Sander and Josh Rieger, who argued with his adoptive mother Joyce about cleaning his room. He had come to Joyce and Brian Smith as a 5-month-old infant from Guatemala, tiny and malnourished with a turned-in foot, but he had grown into their hearts with a completeness that erased any sense of biological separation. The Smith family attended First Assembly Church in St. Peters, Missouri, where Joyce's faith burned bright and constant, a flame she had tended since childhood in Pentecostal pews where miracles were spoken of as both memory and promise. John had rolled his eyes sometimes at his mother's fervent prayers, the way teenagers do when they cannot yet understand the fierce love that drives a parent to their knees. That morning had begun like any other holiday Monday, with Martin Luther King Jr. Day granting the gift of freedom from school and the seduction of adventure calling to 3 8th-grade boys. Joyce had spoken to John on the phone at 11:30, his voice light and carefree, telling her he would be home soon from his friend's house. 3 minutes later, the ice that had looked so solid under the boy's feet gave a sound like gunfire and opened its jaws. John had been wearing shorts and a white t-shirt because the unseasonable warmth of the winter thaw had made the day feel almost like spring, had made the boys forget that beneath the melting surface, the lake was still a hungry, frozen thing. When Joyce's phone rang again at 11:52, it was not her son's voice on the line, but the trembling words of another mother. "There's been an accident. They've pulled John out of the water, and he doesn't have a heartbeat." The drive to the hospital was a blur of prayer and panic. Joyce's hands gripping the steering wheel while her mouth formed words of supplication that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. She had always believed in the God who parted seas and raised the dead, the God who answered when his people cried out in darkness, but never had she imagined she would need such a God for her own son, for the boy who had made her laugh that very morning over breakfast. The roads seemed endless, each traffic light a personal affront, each passing car an obstacle between her and the child who might already be slipping beyond her reach. When she finally burst through the hospital doors, a nurse guided her toward the trauma room with a gentleness that spoke volumes. With the careful tone reserved for those about to be shattered, Joyce did not know, as she approached the room, that the medical team inside had been performing CPR for 27 minutes without success, that they had administered 8 doses of epinephrine with no response, that Dr. Sutterer had already written in his mind the report he would have to file. She did not know that her son's brain had been without oxygen for more than 40 minutes, that his organs were beginning to shut down one by one like lights being switched off in an empty house, that the pediatric ICU had already been alerted that a bed would not be needed after all. She did not know that the doctors were waiting for her arrival not to witness a miracle, but to say goodbye, to see the body one last time before it was taken away. All she knew was that her son was in that room, and she needed to reach him, to touch him, to speak life over him, even if the whole world said there was no life left to speak. When Joyce entered the trauma room, the scene that greeted her was both chaotic and hopeless. A large male nurse performing violent chest compressions that made John's body shudder with each thrust. Monitors displaying flat lines and numbers. That meant nothing to a mother, but everything to the medical professionals who read them. She saw her son's face, pale and still, his features slack in a way that made him look like a stranger, like someone who had already departed for a country from which there is no return. The smell of antiseptic mingled with lake water and something else. Something sterile and final, and for a moment Joyce's knees threatened to buckle beneath her. But then something rose up inside her, something ancient and primal, the same force that had moved women throughout history to stand. Between their children and death itself, she walked to the end of the gurney where John's feet extended from beneath the sheet, and she placed her hands on them, feeling the cold grey skin that seemed more stone than flesh. The doctors paused in their work, uncertain whether to continue, whether to explain to this woman that her son was gone, that medicine had reached its limits and nature had claimed its victory. Joyce closed her eyes, not in acceptance of defeat but in summoning of power, in calling down the only force she believed could overturn the verdict that had already been written. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper or a plea, but a command that rang through the trauma room with the authority of one who knows to whom she speaks. "Holy Spirit, please come and give me back my son." The words tore from Joyce's throat with a desperation that made the nurses flinch, with a faith so raw and unvarnished that it seemed almost dangerous, almost blasphemous in its audacity. She was not asking politely or suggesting tentatively. She was demanding, claiming, insisting that the same power that had breathed life into Adam's nostrils would breathe it into her son's lungs. The air in the room seemed to thicken and shimmer, though later no one would agree on whether this was real or imagined, whether the boundary between heaven and earth had truly grown thin, or whether grief and hope had simply altered their perception. Sister Donna Olson, a nun from the hospital's pastoral care team, stood behind Joyce with her hands on the mother's shoulders, feeling the tremors that ran through Joyce's body as she prayed. For several seconds, nothing changed. The monitor continued its monotone wail. The ventilator kept its mechanical rhythm. John's body remained motionless and cold. Then, so faint that at first no one was certain they had seen it, a single blip appeared on the cardiac monitor, a tiny green spike in the endless flat line. Dr. Sutterer's head snapped toward the screen, his eyes widening, his mouth forming words that would not quite come. Another blip followed, then another, and suddenly the monitor was beeping with a rhythm that had been absent for 43 minutes. A pulse returning from nowhere. From nothing, from beyond the grave itself. Someone shouted, a nurse, perhaps, or a respiratory therapist, scanned the room. erupted into controlled chaos as the medical team scrambled to respond to the impossible thing that was happening before their eyes. Joyce opened her eyes and saw the monitor's green line dancing, saw the numbers that had meant death suddenly shifting toward life, and she began to weep with a violence that matched her prayer. The doctors worked quickly now, their exhaustion forgotten, their medical training taking over, even as their minds struggled to process what they were witnessing. John's heart was beating weakly, irregularly, but beating nonetheless. Blood was flowing through vessels that moments ago had been still and silent. Dr. Sutterer would later describe the moment in clinical terms, speaking of spontaneous cardiac activity and unexplained resuscitation, but in that trauma room, with Joyce's prayers still echoing off the walls, no one pretended that medicine alone had accomplished what they had just seen. Sister Donna stood with tears streaming down her face, her hands still resting on Joyce's shoulders, bearing witness to something that would reshape her understanding of the possible. The immediate crisis was not over. Though John's heart was beating, yes, but his lungs were full of lake water, his brain had been deprived of oxygen for a catastrophic length of time, and his body temperature was dangerously low. Dr. his voice still trembling slightly from shock, recommended immediate transfer to SSM Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital in St. Louis, where Dr. Jeremy Garrett, a nationally recognized expert in drowning and hypothermia cases, could take over his care. Joyce agreed without hesitation, though she insisted on one condition, that everyone who entered her son's room, from this moment forward, would speak only life, only hope, only the possibility of complete recovery. The medical staff nodded, perhaps indulging what they saw as a mother's desperate denial, perhaps beginning to wonder if this woman knew something they did not. The helicopter ride was brief, but turbulent. The winter wind buffing the aircraft as it carried John's fragile, beating heart toward the children's hospital. Joyce and Brian followed by Carr, their hands clasped together in the silent communion of parents who have stared into the abyss and been momentarily reprieved, though they did not yet know at what cost. When John arrived at Cardinal Glennon, Dr. Garrett examined him with the careful attention of a man who has seen many drowning victims, but never quite enough to make the work routine, never quite enough to dull the sharp edge of tragedy. His findings were grim. John's blood pH was 6.6, far below the level typically compatible with life. He had no neurological function beyond basic brainstem reflexes. His organs were failing one by one, and the dirty lake water that had filled his lungs promised infection and complications that could finish what the drowning had started. Dr. Garrett met with Joyce and Brian in a small conference room. His face kind but honest, his words chosen with the precision of someone delivering news that will never be forgotten. He explained that even though John's heart had been restarted on, Garrett used that word, restarted, as if he too could not quite find a medical term adequate to the situation. The boy's chances of survival were virtually non-existent. If by some chance he did survive the night, Garrett continued, he would likely remain in a persistent vegetative state, his brain so damaged by oxygen deprivation that the boy they had known would be gone, replaced by a body that breathed but did not wake. Joyce listened to these words with a face like granite, and when the doctor finished, she looked him straight in the eye and said, "You're wrong. I know you're a good doctor, but you don't know my son. He's a fighter, and God is not finished with him." That night, as John lay unconscious in the pediatric ICU, Pastor Jason Noble from First Assembly Church gathered with 4 other pastors in the boys' room to pray. They anointed John with oil, laid hands on his still body, and called out to the same spirit that Joyce had summoned in the trauma room hours earlier. Noble, whose progressive theology had sometimes clashed with Joyce's more traditional faith, found himself speaking in tongues and prophesying over the boy, declaring things he could not have known through natural means. At one point, Noble later reported, he saw a vision of thousands of lights swirling around John's head, like a divine electrician rewiring a broken circuit, like the fingers of God himself reconstructing the neural pathways that death had torn apart. The other pastors could not see what Noble saw, but they felt something in that room, a presence, a power, an answer moving through the sterile air of the ICU. And then, as the pastors prayed, John's shoulders lifted off the bed, his eyes flew open, and his hand shot out to grip Pastor Noble's wrist with startling strength. The boy's gaze was wild and unfocused, his consciousness surfacing from wherever it had been for the past day. And Noble could only stare in wonder at the thing he had prayed for, but hardly dared to believe. The nurses rushed in, checking vitals and calling for Dr. Garrett, who arrived to find John alert and responsive in a way that should have been medically impossible, given the extent of his injuries. Garrett ran test after test, looking for the catch, the complication, the inevitable deterioration that would reveal this recovery as temporary, a false dawn before the final darkness. But the tests came back better than they should have, better than they could have, and Garrett found himself using a phrase he had rarely employed in 3 decades of pediatric critical care: bona fide miracle. Over the following days, John's recovery accelerated with a speed that defied every medical prediction and textbook precedent. His lungs, which should have been ravaged by infection from the gallons of dirty lake water he had aspirated, came back sterile when biopsy cleaner, as Pastor Noble put it, than yours or mine. His brain, which should have been irreparably damaged by the prolonged oxygen deprivation, began to reawaken section by section, his cognitive functions returning with minimal deficits. On the 10th day, John was removed from the ventilator and began breathing on his own. 3 hours later, he was talking, asking for his friends, wondering why everyone looked so shocked to see him awake. Joyce stood by his bedside, with tears streaming down her face, vindicated but also humbled. Aware that she had witnessed something that would mark the rest of her life, John walked out of Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital on February 4, 2015, exactly 16 days after Tommy Shine had pulled his lifeless body from the frozen lake. He was weak, certainly, and would need physical therapy to regain his full strength. But he walked on his own 2 feet, supported by his parents on either side, emerging into the winter sunlight like someone returning from a long journey. The hospital staff lined the hallways to watch him go, many of them weeping, others applauding, all of them aware they had participated in something that would become legend, that would be spoken of in medical conferences and church testimonies for years to come. Dr. Garrett stood among them, his professional skepticism overridden by the evidence of his own eyes, willing to acknowledge that some recoveries cannot be explained by science alone. News of John's miraculous survival spread through social media like wildfire, igniting prayer chains that stretched around the globe and inspiring stories of renewed faith in places as far away as Germany and Japan. Joyce's phone buzzed constantly with messages from strangers who wanted to share how John's story had touched them, how it had given them courage to believe in their own impossible situations, how it had pulled them back from the edge of despair. A nursing professor at a local university told his students, "There's science, and there's God. This is God." The firefighters from the Lake St. Louis Fire Department stayed in contact with John, attending his award ceremonies and keeping tabs on the boy whose rescue had challenged everything. They thought they knew about survival and death. Tommy Shine, the man who had felt that inexplicable prompting to move 2 steps to the left, spoke openly about the divine guidance that had led his pole directly to John's body in 15 feet of murky water. John returned to Living Word Christian School 2 weeks after leaving the hospital, walking into his classroom to a standing ovation from classmates who had prayed for him daily, who had held vigils and created artwork and never stopped hoping. His teachers hugged him, crying openly. And his basketball teammates, who had played their games in his absence, with his jersey hanging in the locker room, mobbed him with the kind of joy that transcends words. But John himself struggled with the weight of what had happened to him, with the question that haunted his quiet moments. Why me? Why had he been spared when others who prayed just as fervently did not receive their miracles? He had no memory of the time beneath the ice, no recollection of the trauma room, or his mother's prayer, or the moment his heart had restarted. And sometimes, this absence of memory felt like a burden rather than a blessing. Over time, through mentoring and prayer and simply living with the reality of his survival, John began to understand that his story was not just about him, That perhaps he had been given a second life, not to hoard it, but to spend it. To use his voice and his experience to point others toward the same faith that had raised him from death. He began speaking at churches and schools, telling his story with a humility that made people lean forward to listen. That made them believe not in John Smith, but in the God who had answered his mother's desperate prayer. Joyce, too, found herself thrust into a public role she had never sought, writing a book called The Impossible with Ginger Kolbaba, appearing on television programs, and eventually watching as her family's story was transformed into the 2019 film Breakthrough. Starring Chrissy Metz and Marcel Ruiz, the movie premiere in St. Louis felt surreal to the Smith family, seeing their most terrifying day recreated on screen, watching actors portray the prayers and tears and miracles they had lived through. Dr. Garrett O attended the premiere and pronounced the film medically accurate despite some dramatic liberties, noting with dry humor that he was honored to be portrayed by Dennis Hayes, best known for his Allstate insurance commercials. Joyce sat in the darkened theater holding Brian's hand, overwhelmed by the realization that their private agony had become public testimony, that the worst day of their lives had been redeemed into something that might help thousands of others hold on to hope. When the credits rolled and the lights came up, she looked over at John, now 19 years old, tall and healthy, sitting with his girlfriend, Abby Madaris, and felt the full weight of gratitude settle over her like a blanket. Some skeptics would inevitably question whether John's recovery was truly miraculous, or simply the result of favorable physiological conditions. The cold water preservation effect, perhaps, or some quirk of his metabolism that allowed his brain to survive longer without oxygen than would normally be possible. Dr. Garrett himself admitted that there might be medical explanations for what happened. That perhaps John's body temperature dropped quickly enough to protect his organs before they were deprived of blood flow. But Garrett also said, without hesitation, that he considered John's complete recovery a bona fide miracle. That in 30 years of pediatric critical care, he had never seen anything comparable. The timing of the cardiac activity's return, occurring within seconds of Joyce's prayer, remained a fact that no medical explanation could adequately address, a correlation that felt too precise to be coincidence. Yet even Joyce, whose faith had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible, acknowledged the mystery that surrounds questions of divine intervention and answered prayer. When people asked her why God had saved her son while other parents' prayers went unanswered, she could only say, "I don't know. I wish I had an answer." She believed in God's sovereignty, believed that He had plans and purposes beyond human understanding. But she did not pretend to know why some beds became altars of healing while others became places of farewell. This humility, this willingness to live with unanswered questions, made her testimony all the more powerful. She was not claiming to understand God's ways, only to have experienced His power in a moment of ultimate need. The Smith family learned to live with the tension of being both ordinary and extraordinary, of going to the grocery store and church potlucks, while also knowing they had witnessed something that would be studied in medical journals and preached from pulpits around the world. Joyce learned to let go of the small things that had once seemed important, the messy bedroom, the teenage arguments, the daily frustrations that had filled their life before the lake. She had stood in a trauma room and demanded her son's life back from death itself. Nothing else would ever carry quite the same weight. Brian, quieter and more private than his wife, processed the miracle in his own way, grateful but also aware of how close they had come to losing everything, how a single Monday morning had nearly erased their future. As the years passed, the Smith family used their story to encourage others facing impossible situations, but they also insisted on being realistic about the complexities of faith and suffering. They did not promise that everyone who prayed would receive the miracle they desperately sought, did not suggest that faith was a formula that could be manipulated to produce desired outcomes. Instead, they testified to the character of a God who could be trusted even when prayers seemed to go unanswered, who could give peace in the midst of pain, who was present in both the miracles and the mysteries. This balanced message resonated with people who were tired of prosperity gospel promises and false guarantees, who needed hope without hype, truth without triumphalism. John himself, now planning for college and marriage, carried his survival with a mixture of gratitude and sobriety. He knew he had been given something precious, not just life, but a story that could point others toward faith, toward hope, toward the possibility that the impossible might yet be possible. He spoke at youth gatherings and church services, always emphasizing that the miracle was not about him, but about the God who answered his mother's prayer. The God who still moves in ways that science cannot explain and skepticism cannot explain away. Sometimes people asked him what it was like to be dead and then alive again. And he would smile and say honestly that he did not remember. That perhaps that gift of forgetfulness was itself a mercy, a grace that allowed him to move forward without being haunted by those 15 minutes beneath the ice. The lake itself remained, of course, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded on its frozen surface. Winters came and went, ice formed and melted, and other children tested its surface with varying degrees of caution. But for those who knew the story, Lake St. Louis became a landmark of faith, a place where the natural and supernatural had collided in a way that left even doctors using the language of miracles. Signs were posted warning people to stave off thin ice, and perhaps some heeded them because of what had happened to John Smith. Because his story served as both warning and witness, the Lake St. Louis Fire Department kept photos from the rescue in their station, using them to train new firefighters in cold water recovery techniques, while also reminding them that sometimes, despite all their training and equipment, they were participants in mysteries beyond their understanding. The Smith family's story spread far beyond St. Louis, becoming part of the larger narrative of modern faith, of the tension between religious belief and medical science, of the eternal human hunger for signs that death does not have the final word. Pastors preached about Joyce's bold prayer, encouraging their congregations to approach God with similar audacity and expectation. Medical professionals debated the case in journals and conferences, some attributing the recovery to hypothermic protection, while others acknowledged they had no adequate explanation. And ordinary people, facing their own crises and impossibilities, whispered Joyce's words as their own prayer, "Holy Spirit, please, come." They did not always receive the miracle they sought, but they drew strength from knowing that miracles were still possible. That prayer was not merely a comfort, but potentially a catalyst. That the boundary between life and death was more permeable than they had imagined. This is not a story with a tidy moral or a simple takeaway, not a parable designed to teach a single lesson. It is, instead, a testimony raw and real and documented of what happened on January 19, 2015, when a mother's faith collided with her son's death, and somehow, impossibly, faith won. It is a reminder that we live in a world where natural laws usually prevail, but occasionally yield to forces we cannot measure or predict, where the material and the miraculous coexist in ways that challenge both rigid skepticism and naive credulity. It is an invitation to consider that perhaps the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we typically allow, that there might be room for both rigorous science and radical faith, that the heart monitor's sudden beeping after 43 minutes of silence might mean exactly what it appeared to mean. The story of John Smith, the 14-year-old boy who drowned and lived, who died and returned, who was pulled from icy water and then pulled from death itself, stands as one of the most well-documented cases of what believers call a miracle and what science calls an anomaly. Whatever language we use to describe it, the facts remain stubbornly unchanged. He was dead, by every medical definition, and then he was alive. His mother prayed, and his heart started beating. Cause and correlation, skeptics might argue. But correlation so precise and so immediate that it feels like causation to everyone who witnessed it. And perhaps that is enough, not proof, necessarily, but testimony. Evidence that opens rather than closes the question of whether heaven sometimes interrupts the ordinary operations of earth. In the end, what the Smith family offers the rest of us is not a guarantee that our prayers will be answered as dramatically as theirs was, but rather a reminder that we serve a God who is not bound by statistics or limited by natural law. They remind us that miracles, by definition, are rare. If they were common, They would simply be nature. They remind us that faith does not always result in the outcome we desire, but that it still matters, still makes a difference, still opens channels through which divine power can flow. They remind us that a mother's love, when coupled with desperate faith, can sometimes move the very foundations of heaven and earth. They remind us, finally, that the story is never truly over until God says it is over. That death's grip is not as final as it appears, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible becomes possible when someone is brave enough to pray as if they believe it. This account is drawn from verified reporting by NBC News, St. Louis Magazine, the St. Louis Post, and numerous medical sources documenting John Smith's January 2015 drowning and recovery. Dr. Jeremy Garrett's medical assessment, Dr. Kent Sutterer's emergency room records, and the testimony of firefighter Tommy Shine and Pastor Jason Noble all confirm the essential facts of the case. The story was chronicled in Joyce Smith's 2017 book, The Impossible, and adapted into the 2019 film, Breakthrough. John's complete neurological recovery after more than 40 minutes without a pulse remains unexplained by conventional medical science, with Dr. Garrett describing it as a bona fide miracle. This narrative honors the truth of what happened while respecting the dignity of all involved and the mystery that some questions will never be fully answered this side of eternity.